And joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, in Pemberton, British Columbia, via Skype, Nicola Jones, science journalist in residence at the UBC School of Journalism. In Washington, D.C., Joseph Rome, author of the blog climateprogress.org. In New York, New York, Walter Russell Mead, author and senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Here in studio, Quentin Chiotti, senior director of atmospheric issues with Pollution Probe, and Tyler Hamilton, energy and technology columnist with the Toronto Star. And as I welcome everybody, both here in Toronto and in Points Beyond to the program tonight, I want to start with two recent events that have caused a shift in temperature, not so much of our planet, but in the media coverage of this issue that I know you all care so much about. It's called the two gates. Everything with a scandal these days apparently has to have a gate on the end of it. ClimateGate and Glaciergate. And we're just going to remind everybody what those two things are and then come back and discuss the media coverage of this. ClimateGate was the unauthorized release of hundreds of personal emails by climate scientists at the University of East Anglia, UK. Some emails appear to show efforts by scientists to limit publication of opinions questioning climate change and to evade Freedom of Information Act requests. Then there was Glaciergate. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is forced to retract a claim that the Himalayan glaciers would melt by the year 2035. The claim was shown to be not credible and based on poorly sourced evidence. Now, since these two incidents took place, and Walter, I'm going to start with you, how would you rate the mainstream media's coverage of the climate change issue?
I think they've done a bad job because they've made sort of two mistakes. One is they've treated this as primarily a scientific controversy. That is, you know, do these new climate skeptic ideas invalidate the science? And that, I think, is a little misleading. But the other thing is they've failed, I think, to fully cover the devastating political aspect of the story. So they've kind of blurred the line, but they've kind of, how do I put this? There are two ways of thinking about this problem. One is sort of like, you know, to make an analogy, is cigarette smoking bad for you? And that's the science aspect of the story. The other story is Aunt Mildred gonna quit smoking? And I think the media has been caught between these stories and as a result has not done a very good job of either one.
Okay, we'll come back to some of those themes. Joseph Rome in Washington, how would you rate the mainstream, we're talking mainstream media now, not the blogosphere. How have they done since these two incidents took place?
Well, I tend to agree. The media coverage has been really pretty dreadful. The media has, you know, kind of taken pretty inconsequential errors and used that to then sort of give legitimacy to the most extreme anti-scientific views. Really, you know, I think people need to understand the bottom line is that the warming of the planet is unequivocal. Everywhere you look, ice is melting. The last decade was the hottest decade on record. And humans are the principal cause. Really not a lot of dispute about that in the scientific community. There's no question that in, you know, this 3,000-page report, the IPCC report, there were one or two, you know, relatively trivial mistakes, as the Washington Post put it, but they have been used as an excuse by some in the media to question the entire science. And you know, the analogy I use is every major newspaper publishes corrections every single day, and yet they expect the public to come back and believe what's in the newspaper. But somehow, again, in this 3,000-page report, there's a couple of trivial mistakes, and now the media feels that it can quote kind of extreme anti-scientific, widely discredited you know, contrarians as if they were somehow credible sources against the entire body of the scientific community.
Okay, so Joseph is also critical of media, but for a different reason than Walter Russell Mead is. Nicola Jones in British Columbia, how do you view it?
I guess what I would say is that I think what these incidents have done is really blown open the kind of social science of how science is done, the fact that science is messy. Science isn't just this really clean activity. And I think a lot of journalists don't know quite how to deal with that because they've been treating science for a very long time as if it is a totally clean and perfect activity. There's this notion that journalists go to scientists, the scientist tells them the quote truth, they write that down, end of story. that's maybe not the right thing to have been doing all along. And what this has shown is that they can't do that. That there are messy things going on behind the process of science that are just as important, perhaps, as the facts that are achieved at the end.
Quentin, how would you rate it?
Well, I think it's a bit of a tempest in a teapot, but it also goes back to the whole approach that the media tends to take, and that is try to present a balanced argument, because let's face it, having two sides to an issue makes for a good storyline. And for the most part, when you look at the treatment that media has on the climate change science issue, it's always taken that approach. And I think now, as the other guests have indicated, these are really trivial issues that have been identified. Not to say that the email issue wasn't significant, but it doesn't take away from the main message that the preponderance and evidence is that the climate change science is sound, global warming is already occurring, and we've got some real serious issues to deal with, and this has sidetracked us from that key issue. Okay, sitting beside you, thank you for not pulling your punches just because you've got a guy from the largest circulation newspaper in the country sitting beside you there, but you've written a lot about this, obviously. I guess part of this discussion here focuses on you and what you and your fellow journalists are doing on this. How would you rate the coverage?
I think the coverage, I agree with Joe on this. The coverage has focused more on these little errors. And to put it in perspective, there's fewer errors in the IPCC report than, far fewer than, say, the Encyclopedia Britannica. And for the limited space that we have in print, the limited time we have on television, the online world's a different thing. I think we're devoting way too much time on these specific errors, which many organizations have written off as trivial, and trying to set that up as this collapse of an international organization that's doing its best and isn't perfect, but has pretty much got it right.
Let me read something that Joseph wrote on his climateprogress.org blog back in January. Protesting the mushy middle is what we're calling this. The media downplay the threat of global warming and hence the cost of inaction, and they still hedge on attributing climate impacts to human action. If the top New York Times reporter, Andrew Revkin, is pushing the mushy middle, if he writes things like, quote, even with the increasing summer retreats of sea ice, which many polar scientists say probably are being driven in part by global warming caused by humans, if his stories have online headlines like Arctic ice hints at warming, specialists say, why on earth would it be news that the public is itself stuck in the mushy middle? Joseph, let me unpack some of this with you here, because reporters, of course, feel that it is not their job to pick sides in stories, and that is often why they hug the so-called mushy middle, as you've put it. Why do you feel that this is not a responsible approach to take when it comes to covering this issue?
Well, this is one of those issues where there is an overwhelming understanding by, 99% of climate scientists, and agreed to by every member government of the Intergovernmental Panel. 193 governments sign off on the summaries word for word. We're talking about Saudi Arabia, China, even the Bush administration. So when the media kind of does a on the one hand, on the other hand, like this is some sort of political story, the public is left with the notion that there's a lot of ambiguity, doubt, a lot of debate, whereas it doesn't really exist in the scientific community. I do want to highlight another issue too. Both my parents were professional journalists. Sometimes the headlines are a lot worse than the stories, and that's because the stories have a lot of space to be thoughtful, and people are writing kind of these dramatic headlines to get attention. So I don't want to just make it look like it is the reporters here. I think the editors involved, both in story selection and headline writing, bear a certain brunt of the blame. But from my perspective on climateprogress.org, I think the big debate in the scientific community is between whether doing nothing on global warming would be really bad or an unmitigated catastrophe. That's kind of where the range of the scientific debate is, whereas in the media you get voices from people who say global warming's a hoax, it might even be good for us. I mean, stuff that has virtually no credibility in the peer-reviewed scientific literature.
Walter, you want to comment on that, where the range of the debate really is, or the kind of how tough the rules are for journalists who feel they've got to get both sides of a story, even if they're not of equal merit?
Well, Look, I think what we're missing here is that a huge political story has taken place. Not a science story, but a political story since really the email hacking. And that is that for a combination of factors, some having to do with these problems with the global climate science kerfluffles, and some with American politics, there's essentially zero prospect of an international treaty this year, as pretty much everyone has now conceded. It's rather unlikely, since the U.S. Congress was probably going to be a little more Republican next year than this year, that any progress will be possible next year either. It's a huge story. And for the media to be, in a sense, distracted over, you know, what's going on in the science while missing this, and really looking at why did that happen, what's going on, I think it is a serious oversight.
Tyler?
I just think there's too many pundits and general columnists out there trying to make it into a political story. No one's really writing about the timing of all of this happening. We got this international conference, there's so much anticipation built up, and then suddenly these emails emerge, and suddenly everybody's going through the IPCC 2007 report with a fine-tooth comb. I think the stories that I haven't seen written are the ones about, well, who got access to these emails? You put it as an unauthorized release, but it's really up in the air exactly how these things got out. And I think
that's
earlier,
part of the story. There's a ton of stories here. That's one of them. They should all, you know, but there should be really a lot more reporting on the politics of what's going
well,
on.
I'm not a political reporter, so I'll leave that for other people, but I do think that another story being missed is the fact that since the IPCC report came out, there is even more disturbing and overwhelming evidence that things have gotten worse. And the next IPCC report will show that. And my fear is that the scientists that are doing this work are going to be much more reserved than they really should be to show how bad things are getting. And there's a little bit of a science chill going on.
Quentin, where do you come down on this issue of whether this ought to be covered more as a political story or a science story? And, you know, have we done a good job covering it as a science story to begin with?
Well, I think it's both. You hit the nail on the head. And you know, on the science side, again, because of this disconnect between the science discourse and the popular discourse, that, you know, 99% of the IPCC scientists have a consensus, and in the media, it's you know, one skeptic versus one climate change scientist. So that you have that problem. So the science has been poorly communicated. And then on the political side, whether or not it's the politics of it or just simply why aren't we taking action? And then, you know, bring this around back to the Canadian situation, and we've had a lot of inaction certainly at the federal level, and very much with what's going on in the U.S. You know, we're unlikely to have much going on in Canada, who's waiting to take the lead of the U.S. So we're sitting here and we're twiddling our thumbs, and things aren't getting done.
Let me welcome to our discussion as well now in Berkeley, California, Curtis Brainard, who's with the Columbia Journalism Review. And Curtis, we just read a quote from Joseph Rome's climateprogress.org blog a while ago, focusing on what he calls the mushy middle that journalists feel that they have to inhabit because, you know, they've always got to do on the one hand, on the other hand kind of a story, and they worry about getting too out on the edge of either side. Do the rules of journalism, in your view, prohibit mainstream media from covering the climate change issue in the way that many scientists feel it ought to be covered?
Well, no, I don't think that those rules prohibit journalists from covering the story as it should be covered, because those rules aren't set in stone. That traditional journalistic norm of balance is there for a very good reason. I think it's appropriate to stick to that when covering a lot of stories, but clearly this climate change story is something where journalists need to reconsider that norm. And I think to some extent they have, you know, in the early years of climate change coverage, although I'm not thinking all the way back in the 80s, but rather in this decade, around 2004, 2005, this problem of balance is bias, it's been called, was really a problem. Journalists didn't have a lot of familiarity with subject material, so they would go out and talk to a climate scientist and get his or her opinion, and then do what they'd been trained to do, flip it over and talk to a skeptic and get his or her rebuttal. But over the years, and I think especially after the release of the 2007 IPCC report, journalists did begin to weed that problem out of their coverage a little bit. There's a guy by the name of Maxwell Boykoff, who was at Oxford or Cambridge University, I believe, and recently transferred to the University of Colorado, who's been tracking this trend. And he did, in fact, find in some of his most recent research that problem had tapered off a bit. Since ClimateGate, you know, the so-called gate affairs and Glaciergate and all that, I think that we've seen an unfortunate resurgence in the amount of space that journalists are giving to skeptics, and I don't think they've really tackled these recent controversies in the way they should have.
Okay, let me put this to Nicola then in British Columbia. Some say that the overwhelming body of evidence and the overwhelming body of science is pointing to a potential climate catastrophe that is so significant it threatens our way of life, it threatens our jobs, it threatens everything, and that the job of the media right now should be to drive home the seriousness of this issue and urge people to take action. Do you agree that that's the media's job right now?
It depends whether you believe that media should be in an advocacy role or not. I mean, I think it's always the media's job to critically evaluate the information that's out there and present it as honestly and as well as they can. I mean, I guess I wanted to get back to this question of the mushy middle and the idea of whether journalists can properly present balance in a story without just going to a so-called skeptic. I think the really important issue there is not that you get, you know, person A says climate change is real, person B says it's not. You need to look at who these people are that you're talking to. And there's a real issue of expertise and whether the people that you're talking to are qualified to say the thing that they're saying. So I think in more traditional kind of stories about politics, perhaps, where the issue at stake is not one of facts, but one of personal opinion, it doesn't matter who you ask. You can ask person A, person B, each person's opinion is perfectly valid. But on an issue of climate change, perhaps if you're getting someone saying that something is not true or something else is true, if they're not qualified to say that, then why should you be presenting their opinion? And I also just wanted to say that in that blog post about the mushy middle, you know, that headline I think said, I can't remember the specific story question, but it said might be happening. And you know, often that is the best way of representing the state of the science. That is a proper representation of what scientists actually know about a situation, that something might be happening. You know, and I hope that the story would get into details as to what extent we think that to be true.
Yeah, the headline you're talking said Arctic ice hints at warming, specialists say, and obviously those who have spent their lives trying to convince the public that global warming is a real thing and it's caused by our action. That was not a helpful headline. But let me follow up with Joseph for a second on this. And again, on this issue, Joseph, of what the media's role ought to be right now. Those who believe that the mainstream media's job right now ought to be in some ways to, you know, marshal the resources, to encourage the marshaling of resources of society in order to tackle that issue. Do you believe that's their role right now?
I don't know if I would characterize it that way. I do think that the media has a responsibility to explain to the public clearly what happens if we keep doing nothing and we just emit more and more greenhouse gas emissions. I think the scientific community has failed to communicate that clearly, and I think therefore the media has. I don't think this is entirely the media's fault, but yes, I think that all I can say is assuming that we don't take the necessary action, historians in 2 or 3 or 4 decades are going to look back and they are just going to be baffled by everything we did, from the media to the scientific community to the politicians. All I can say is, you know, my brother lived in Pass Christian, Mississippi. He got hit. His home was destroyed by the storm surge of Hurricane Katrina, and I used to spend a lot of time talking about clean energy, and then I started talking to the top climate scientists in the country. Frankly, I wanted to advise my brother whether he should rebuild his home or not. And all I can say is, if you go out and actually talk to the top climate scientists in this country, and they're not hard to find, because you could just ask 20 scientists who are the top ones, and they'd all probably agree. Ask them what they think is going to happen if we keep taking no action, and then read the scientific literature, particularly in the last couple of years, and I've posted a lot of it at climateprogress.org. You are going to be baffled, like many climate scientists are, as to how the heck it is that the nation and the world keeps doing nothing. It is risking the self-destruction of civilization. I mean, we're talking now sea level rise of 3 to 6 feet projected as likely by the end of the century. The large part of the U.S. Southwest could be turned into a dust bowl. Planetary warming of 9–10 degrees Fahrenheit. Utter change in what the world is, in the climate that has been pretty stable for 10,000 years, that billions of people now rely on fresh water, the right temperature, agriculture.
Okay, let me get the two journalists to comment on this. Let's go first of all to Curtis in California, and then Tyler, I'll get you as well. Go ahead, Curtis.
Well, you know, I agree with Joe that we absolutely need more coverage of the impacts and likely consequences of global warming. But that's a really tough story for journalists, and it's one that it's a story that often doesn't get told right, because once you start to get into the exact timing and scale of some of these impacts, you're necessarily going to have to start talking about some of the given uncertainty that comes with some of these predictions. You know, once you start talking about the impacts, you're getting into an area of climate science where there isn't as much consensus and there isn't as much uncertainty, certainty as there is with the fundamental tenets of climate science, that the world is getting warmer and that humans are likely the primary cause of that. You know, that's not to say that this story can't be told right, but journalists have to exercise a special amount of care when pursuing such topics. I've often said that it's almost like, you know, the McDonald's disclaimer on their coffee, you know, that this is a hot cup of coffee, that, you know, when journalists are approaching these subjects, they need to put a disclaimer at the top of their story saying, you know, warning, this story reflects legitimate uncertainties about the timing and scale of impacts of climate change. However, that does nothing to undermine, you know, the fundamental tenets that the Earth is in fact getting warmer, and that humans are the likely driver of that warming. So it's just a much, much trickier subject, and it requires more time, it requires more space, and these are all the things that are in short supply in newsrooms today, unfortunately.
Tyler.
I agree that uncertainty can be and should be reflected in any story that tries to delve into these issues.
Can I just stop you there for a second, though? I mean, here's the problem. We have Joseph on the one hand saying this is a virtually irrefutable fact. It's happening and we're the cause of it. And now I hear two journalists saying, wait a second, you have to reflect some uncertainty around all of this when you do your stories as well.
But that doesn't mean
How does
providing...
the layperson react to that?
That doesn't mean providing a soapbox for somebody who's a skeptic to have a lot of space in the story. It's really just a few lines just to let people know, like, you're reading this at your own risk, but this is the way we see things. What I wanted to say, though, too, is that I want to know when advocacy kind of became a bad word. It just seems like we're seeing scientists are becoming advocates and journalists. You know, there is different types of journalism, and if you're a reporter who covers this issue, this is your beat. It's your job to do the research, to talk to the scientists, to form some sort of an opinion so that you can speak authoritatively. And to be able to condense that information in a way that the reader can understand or the viewer can understand. And I think the fact that you're just playing a game of Lego and taking quotes and stuff from other people is not my job. My job is to know exactly, get a handle on this issue. What bothers me is when you see stuff like ClimateGate emerge and you have these columnists who don't cover this on a regular basis, stealing quotes and things from other newspapers and just kind of assembling it without any knowledge of where those quotes and information came from. I wrote a column recently about some columns that Margaret Wente at the Globe and Mail wrote and Terence Corcoran at the National Post, and they were commenting on what some scientist in Canada said, Andrew Weaver, and they never talked to him. I called him up and he was completely grateful that I would ask his view and what he actually said and what the context was, and I found that disturbing.
Okay, they're obviously not here to defend themselves.
No, obviously not.
They will.
That's too bad.
If they're watching this program, they can take a shot at you in their column. Quentin, a quick follow-up, and then I'm going to play something after that.
Well, I was going to say I'm the scientist amongst the group and the one who's actually done research on impacts and adaptation through 2 national assessments. And, you know, there's sufficient evidence out there to indicate that we're in serious trouble and that the problems are going to be significant. And yet there's not a lot of journalists who actually have the expertise and the ability to take a 448-page document and actually synthesize it down into bite-sized form
I'm
that
going
the
to come
public
back to
can
this.
understand.
We're definitely going to come back to that later on. Walter Russell Mead, I want to read something that you wrote on the American Interest Online earlier in March, and then I'll get you to comment further on it. For years now, you write, skeptic has been a dirty word at the New York Times when the subject of climate change comes up. Excuse me, but reporters are supposed to be skeptics. They are supposed to be cynical, hard-bitten people. If the New York Times and its peers had come at this story with more skepticism and rigor from the beginning, climate scientists would have realized long ago that if they hope to convince a skeptical world, they need to be ultra-careful, ultra-cautious, and even ultra-conservative in their public statements and recommendations. They would have understood long ago that because their science is important, they have to do it more carefully and more publicly than other people. That may be harsh and it may be unfair in some sense, but when you're dealing with the interests of billions of people, you have to expect a little bit of scrutiny. Okay, why do you think, Walter, that the problem is not that reporters are sort of downplaying the scientific evidence, but that they actually may be too trusting of climate scientists?
Well, what I was thinking of quite specifically there was that Pachauri, the head of the IPCC, used that glacier example constantly. He used other things in his speeches that have had to be taken back. And when the head of the IPCC harps on a particular point, it becomes an important point when it turns out it's not correct. And I think what happened is that there was, particularly at the IPCC and at the top leadership, there was really a lack of awareness of just how tough this is. The climate science, the implications of climate science are that every country in the world is going to have to make fundamental changes in its economy. There are, when you think about the interests that are ranged on the side of the status quo, they're enormous. You think about the size of the winners and the losers that these changes might produce. They're enormous. Of course, there's going to be incredibly well-funded, incredibly disciplined, incredibly strategic pushback. Of course, there's going to be extremely difficult. Nationalism hasn't even begun to get mixed up into this much in places like India and China. It certainly will be. And so I think what happened is, again, the press didn't in a sense give the climate change people a sense of the environment they were going to be in, and so they've kind of I wouldn't disagree that that the scientific consensus is what it is, but they have been a little too careless, particularly a few very high-profile people. And as a result, the public confidence in the IPCC process has been, I think, effectively destroyed in a lot of countries.
Okay, let me follow up with Nicola on that.
Unfairly, perhaps.
Nicola, I'm going to follow up with this, and you'll forgive me if I'm mixing my metaphors a bit here, but have the preponderance of journalists been too trusting of climate scientists insofar as they regard whatever climate scientists say as if it were coming down from Mount Sinai, for example?
I mean, I think in general it's true that, journalists, when they are trained to be journalists, they have these skeptical antennae that go up when you're talking to certain people and you do want to take everything with a grain of salt. And I think those antennae are particularly awake and aware when journalists are talking to, say, politicians, and maybe traditionally have been less awake and aware when talking to scientists. And I teach a journalism course at UBC, or sometimes do. And one of the things I really try to hammer home to those students is, yeah, you have to be critical when you're talking to scientists. Not everything that they say is going to be 100% true. You need to ask them why they're saying what they're saying or what their evidence is. But that said, I don't think we need to be go over the top on that. I don't think there was any particular reason to suspect that the particular claim about the Himalayan glaciers was faulty, given that sort of fit with a larger body of evidence that is substantiated about glaciers disappearing in general. So I think it would have been very difficult for journalists on that particular point to pick up that particular piece of information maybe wasn't as substantiated as it could have been.
Curtis Brainard in California, can you tell me whether you think journalists have been too trusting of climate scientists in their coverage?
Well, I might say slightly, and I might just put it differently, you know, to kind of echo Walter's writing. I think that they should be more skeptical. Again, I agree with Nicola, we don't want to go overboard here, but the journalists definitely should be out there asking more questions about how the scientists know what they know. I think especially when it comes to the exact timing and scale of these impacts. Again, you know, we need to be very careful in our stories that as we're, you know, and we need to explain to our readers that as we're asking these questions, as we're being skeptical, you know, none of this undermines, you know, again, the fundamental tenets that global warming is certainly a very serious problem, and that we are most likely responsible for it, and that we do need to begin taking action. But at the same time, I absolutely think we can begin asking tougher questions of these scientists. And again, this is why I thought that the American media in particular needed to get on this, the story of the recent controversy surrounding the IPCC much more quickly than it did. Not, again, because these were very significant errors. In fact, what we saw happening overseas, because I agree with Joe here, is that the British media was just blowing some of this way out of proportion. And that, in fact, was why the American media needed to get on the ball. Not to kind of trump up these errors, but to kind of nip this, you know, a tempest in a teapot in the bud, as some people have been calling it. They needed to get in there and explain that, in fact, these are very trivial errors, that, in fact, the IPCC is taking steps to address some of the flaws in its review processes. You know, when I wrote about this, I cited two headlines. One, a terrible front page story in the New York Times by Elizabeth Rosenthal that had the headline, climate scientists face, you know, a siege on their credibility, which was just terrible. I compared that to a much more, what I think, appropriate and accurate headline by the Associated Press, which said something to the effect of the IPCC is taking, you know, steps to address, you know, recent issues with their review process. I mean, it's not a sexy headline. It doesn't give you that front page thought.
But it's more accurate.
It defies the conflict narrative that we love in journalism, but it's more accurate. You know, this is really a story about how the IPCC has responded, you know, and not really a story about how all of a sudden climate skeptics have the other hand. I mean, the IPCC is still a very robust organization, sure. Maybe it could have some procedural changes. You know, there's a lot that it
Okay,
could
let
do
me get
to
Joseph
adapt.
into this. I want to hear follow-up
Yeah.
from Joseph and then from Tyler. Go ahead, Joseph, to you first.
Well, you know, I've never been the biggest fan of the IPCC because it's a very unwieldy process. I mean, I think that the scientists made a mistake in that they left the impression that their entire report was based on the peer-reviewed literature, when in fact, particularly in their effort to try to understand the regional impacts, which the models aren't very good at, they've used a lot more of the so-called gray literature, and I think that was a mistake. But I just don't think it makes sense to put out 3 1,000-page reports. It's just too much information. But I think the bigger problem with the IPCC is that these summary reports have to be signed off on word for word by every single member government, and it just tends to water down what gets said. And the end result, ironically, while the media has portrayed recent events as suggesting that the IPCC has overestimated and hyped what's going to happen in the future, in fact, most of the scientific community, if you were to interview 100 scientists, they would tell you the IPCC has bent over backwards to be incredibly conservative in what it says, and that, for instance, in terms of sea level rise, they ignored largely sort of these dynamic collapses or disintegration of the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets, and that now most of the scientific literature suggests much higher sea level rise than the IPCC had ever warned about. So I think that, frankly, it's very good for the IPCC to get its house in order, but I don't think the IPCC is going to have a lot of credibility in this country with a great many people who it needs to have credibility with, and that the United States needs its own scientific process, probably built around the National Academy of Sciences, to articulate a review of the scientific literature and an explanation of what's going to happen.
Okay, Tyler, your follow?
On the issue of journalists needing to be more skeptical, I think that part of the problem is reflective of the state of the media in general. We have more dilution of the reporting. We don't have specialists on the beat, science reporters, environmental reporters. Those are the only reporters that are really going to go there and interview the scientists and go through the reports and maybe say, you know, I'm going to question this guy or this woman on this particular issue because it's a little iffy. If you're expecting general assignment reporters or political reporters to do that, that's not going to happen, right? So what you're going to end up having is the mushy middle. The lazy approach to skepticism is to stick to the mushy middle, and that's what we're seeing.
Nicola, that's not a bad point, is it? I mean, the fact is that most journalists have come up through the humanities stream as opposed to through the science stream, and if you've been used to covering city council or, you know, state house or provincial assembly or something like that, and suddenly you've been sent to go cover climate change, I mean, you really are baffled most of the time, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, I live in a slightly different world, working mostly with nature, where most of the staff has a science degree, and that's what we do. You know, we're in the business of science journalism. But yeah, we've seen huge job losses in the United States of science journalists. There are very few science journalists who, you know, that's their actual job description in Canada. So yeah, and the financial model of journalism is going to let specialty journalism like science journalism down over the coming years, and we're not sure what's going to happen or how to fix that.
Walter, let me follow up with you on this angle of it. Again, IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, representing, I don't know, how many countries are we up to now? It's almost 200 countries, isn't it, that have sort of signed off on the conclusions that climate change is happening and that people are probably responsible for it. And I guess, Walter, part of the difficulty here in trying to convince many people, more people about this, is that a lot of the inconsistencies, quibbles, problems, issues, whatever that we've talked about so far, were not actually discovered by the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, but in fact in the blogosphere. And it was partisan bloggers who unmasked some of these troubles rather than the mainstream media, and that has sort of added to the distrust over the whole thing. How much of a role do you think that's played in people's unease with this issue so far?
I think it's actually very important because if you look certainly in the U.S., I imagine some similar things are true in Canada, polling shows a progressive decline of trust by the public in authority figures of all types, politicians especially, but also journalists. And so on the IPCC thing, what happened was you basically had some sort of skeptical people in the blogosphere going, look, there's something wrong, and the media apparently ignoring it. And then it turns out, oh, the skeptic was right. Rajendra Pachauri had no clothes on when he talked about the glaciers. Maybe he was better dressed on other times. And so what happened was that the media then is wrong-footed. But I think it's important to get to this point, you know, that I think is right about the IPCC. With all of these countries involved, the final product is almost inevitably flawed. Here is, again, the policy issues that I think journalism has been missing, which is if a 194 country process can't produce a good report, how is a 194 country process going to produce a good treaty? And a treaty that can actually solve problems. It's actually harder to do a treaty than to do a report. And so in some ways, the kinds of discrediting of the IPCC go more deeply, again, not to the science, but to the policy, to the strategy of trying to deal with this thing through the UN treaty process, through a number of other choices, political choices that have been made about what to do about the science as opposed to the science themselves. And these choices taken all together have, I think, put the movement to stop climate change in an untenable position where nothing is going to happen for a while. And that is the story that the press missed, much more than anything else about what was going on in the science. This whole important movement painted itself into a corner without a lot of attention from the press. And it's not a science story. It's a politics story. Human journalists with degrees in the humanities and political experience should have been able to see this one.
Understood. Let me ask the scientist here, Quentin, about the difference between cynicism, which I don't think the media are supposed to be, and a healthy skepticism, which they are supposed to be. Do you think scientists appreciate the fact that when they deal with reporters, they are dealing with people who, by nature, by design, by reputation, by profession, by training, are supposed to be bringing a healthy skepticism to everything they hear, even from scientists.
Well, I mean, those are good points. My sense is that a lot of the scientists don't have a good track record in terms of dealing with media and communicating their key messages. So I think that's a prevailing problem, not just for climate change, but across the board.
Scientists don't know how to communicate, you're saying?
To the broader community and key messages, no, they don't, certainly not to decision makers. The other aspects of the whole climate science issue, and I think it was Joseph who may have mentioned this earlier, is that the whole aspect of climate science and meteorological science and modeling is very different, I think, from other aspects of the messages on the impacts and the adaptations. There are differences between the science communities on that subject matter. And I think when it comes to dealing with the media, as soon as they start dealing with actions and on the advocacy side, let's face it, I don't think a lot of the scientists really truly understand the role of advocacy and how their science should be used in informing policy outcomes. You start talking to a climate modeler about what we should be doing about transportation and energy, I don't think they really know. Now, granted, within the IPCC, you have 3 working groups, so you do have those that have an understanding of mitigation, of adaptation, and policy, but that's quite different from those that are dealing with climate science.
Well, Curtis, let me follow up on that word understanding that Quentin just used there. And the scientific complexity of this story has always been, I suspect, for too many journalists, a real hard wall to jump over. And no doubt too many journalists just don't get scientists. But I suspect the converse of that is also true. How much of all of that is at play here as one side tries to understand the other and the other side tries to explain what's going on to the viewing public, the reading public, and so on?
Well, clearly, there's been a lot of breakdowns in communication, and, I think that this recent affair, this, Glaciergate affair, which I hate to keep referring to these things as gates. I think it's a terrible term, but this story, the credit for breaking the story was given to the Sunday Times of London, but they didn't actually break this story. In fact, it was a reporter for Science magazine by the name of Palava Bagla who broke this in Science magazine all the way back in November. Now, the Sunday Times article didn't appear, I think, until January, even early February. He broke it first in the journal Science, and then he wrote another article for the BBC. So this was already out there. And how did Rajendra Pachauri act? Very defensively, because I think that there was a confusion on Pachauri's part as he didn't know who he was dealing with. He didn't understand, I think he was kind of lumping this reporter Bagla with the rest of the climate skeptics out in the blogosphere who have, gone overboard with their demands on climate scientists and who have acted too aggressively. But I think in this case, Pachauri's confusion really hurt him and the IPCC in the long run, because where he had an opportunity to address this, again, very trivial mistake early on, he reacted aggressively and defensively against this reporter. And then when the Sunday Times broke, well, again, it didn't break, but when it wrote its article on the same affair a little over a month later, then all of a sudden skeptics and less careful members of the press could go back and say, oh, look, this came up months ago and he's been stalling and he's, been acting tribalistically and defensively and aggressively. And so I think that those kinds of breakdowns in communications have really hurt the IPCC. And they probably also thwarted the media's ability to explain these problems effectively and efficiently. Because again, if Pachauri had decided to work with Bagla when he was originally breaking this story, Bagla, I think, would have been able to then, give it fuller context, explain again that this was not a main conclusion of the IPCC. It didn't appear in the summary for policymakers. But, again, Pachauri kind of shut him down, and this all of a sudden became really a bigger problem and a bigger story than it should have been.
Well, let me follow up with Nicola on this. How much of the lack of traction on the climate change issue, for example, among decision makers, among people who have the ability to make policy, how much of that lack of traction would you put at the foot of scientists and journalists, neither of whom understand or get the other's world very well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a huge confusion between the two. You know, the number one thing that science journalists at a place like Nature might hear from scientists is after an interview, the scientist might say, "Oh, feel free to send me that story before you publish it so I can fact check it for you." And, you know, of course, this goes against normal journalistic tenets. I mean, you would never send a story back to a politician saying, "Oh, can you just read this over before I publish it to make sure it's
No, but let me interrupt for a
sound
second here. Nicola, let me interrupt for a second. You'd never do that in politics. But given the complexity of science, would you recommend that journalists do that for scientists?
Well, no, because a journalist should be very certain of their facts, and if they don't understand their facts, then maybe they need to get a follow-up phone call to the scientist to make sure that they understood it properly. But the entire story itself, the framing of the story, the critique that's in the story, the presentation of different sides, and the weight that's given to different information, that's within the purview of the journalist, which, you know, we heard expressed very eloquently earlier. It's a journalist's job to get a handle on those facts and decide for themselves, you know, where they think the truth lies.
Let me do a follow-up with
Present
Tyler on this then. Forgive me for shutting everybody down a little more quickly here, but we're down to about our last 5 minutes and want to cover a couple of things still. Tyler, have you ever written a piece and sent it to the scientist in question that you interviewed and said, "Would you just mind eyeballing this to make sure I got everything right"? You ever done that?
I haven't sent the entire piece, but I've taken bits of information, maybe in point form, that frame the way I understand it and say, does this make sense? Am I getting this right? So that they don't have a hand on how the story is being written, but they can correct blatant errors if I'm just not getting it. I think that's a responsible approach.
Well, okay, let me ask you about that, because a political reporter would never do that. But a scientific reporter, I mean, do your editors know you do that?
I don't know if they know I do that, but I don't think that I haven't seen anybody complaining about it. I have talked to colleagues about it, other colleagues that cover science, other colleagues who cover high-tech industry, for example. You are dealing with very complex issues, and I'm not so foolish as to think that I can understand all this stuff. I'm a journalist, not an engineer or a scientist.
Quentin?
I just echo that from the perspective of someone that journalists come to do stories on climate change or air quality. I've often been given articles after they've been published. They'll come back and they'll do fact checking with me, but I would never influence. I would basically give them, you know, these are the different approaches you could take. They're the ones that have that journalistic pen. They're the ones that make that decision.
And, you know, and ultimately, if I send it off and they come back, I don't have to listen to it. I have the choice to just ignore it. But it's just, you know, correcting a certain word that maybe doesn't really make sense. It's a pretty basic thing.
Sure. Now, Walter, you'd never do that in politics because you'd be terrified about getting spun by a guy who's trying to, you know, change the thrust of what you've done. Would it be appropriate to do it in the world of science, given how much these two entities, journalists and scientists, don't really understand each other?
Again, I just don't think the big problem here has been with the science. Balancing a story is a problem no matter what you're dealing with. If you're dealing with a story about economics, you know, economics is actually as complicated as climate science is, and it's interesting that economists don't agree about a lot of things too. And trying to figure out as a journalist, you know, what is really going on with a story about financial regulation is really no harder and very little different from trying to get a climate story right. So I think the principles of good journalism don't change much from field to field.
Okay, Joseph, let me finish up on this then. The media are dealing with, in their world, revolutionary change right now. Declines in revenues, accelerated news cycles, all these all-news channels, the proliferation of blogs that they're competing with they've never had to. How do you think all of those trends affect the mainstream media's ability to do what we would traditionally think of as solid, investigative, intelligent, thoughtful coverage of perhaps one of the most complex issues we've ever had to deal with?
Well, I think it seriously hurt it. I think there's no question that they've been letting go science reporters, environmental reporters. Just read, I think, on one of our guest blogs that we just lost another environmental blog at a newspaper. You know, here's what I'll say. I'll just do a plug. I'm a physicist by training. Spend a lot of time talking to climate scientists and reading the literature. I think the good news about the decline in the mainstream media and the rise of the blogosphere is that if you want to know, you know, much more in-depth analysis of climate sciences and climate politics that Walter Russell Mead mentioned, and economics, you know, come to climateprogress.org, where I have the time and the space. I have links, interviews with scientists. I think you know, the good news is people who want to find a lot more information can do so on the internet. I think the bad news is that as the mainstream media has sort of abandoned, I think, serious science journalism, that they've moved this over to the political realm. The treatment is more sensationalistic. The headlines are written in a very grabbing way because people need to get eyeballs. So I think, unfortunately, I think that mainstream media coverage is probably going to continue to decline, and people are going to have to look online to sources that they find give them the kind of information that they want.
Less than 2 minutes. Let me get Curtis to respond to this as well. All of those trends I mentioned earlier, Curtis, how are they affecting mainstream media's ability to cover this story properly?
Well, the blogosphere is putting a lot of pressure on the mainstream media because what the blogosphere is great at is being extremely fast. It's rapid, and there are a lot of bloggers, I think, as we see again and again, as we've been talking about today, that are more than willing to rush out with snap judgments and play loose with facts, you know.
They don't worry as much about accuracy, do they?
No, not at all, not at all. And there's, of course, not the same level of fact-checking, editing, all of that. But what that does is that puts the media in a reactionary position because the mainstream media is simply not going to be as fast. I mean, again, these are issues that take time to report. These stories, told rightly, need time. You know, they need space. And, you know, again, these are in short supply. And so what the blogosphere is doing is, you know, I agree with Joe. It's pushing the media to, you know, report and publish faster than it really should be doing. It should be taking more time to consider some of these. It should be taking more time, taking more time to talk to sources. And it's also, you know, pushing again for these kind of sensational headlines. I totally agree. I mean, that's what the blogosphere is all about. And unfortunately, I think to a large extent, the media, in order to compete, has been, you know, kind of sinking to that level, to use that expression, and putting out these kind of sensationalistic, attention-grabbing headlines, going back to these kind of false narratives about conflict, when in fact the story is perhaps less sexier, but also simpler to tell if they would just give themselves the time and space to do it right.
Okay, Curtis, we gave everybody an hour tonight to try to get it right, which is not bad by television standards, so glad the CJR could be part of this conversation tonight. Curtis Brainard from the Columbia Journalism Review in Berkeley, California. Nicola Jones at the University of British Columbia. We've caught her on Skype in Pemberton, BC. Joseph Rome, climateprogress.org. There's another plug for you, Joseph. Thanks for being on the line from Washington. Our good friend Walter Russell Mead, always happy to have him from the Council of Foreign Relations from New York, New York. Here in studio, Tyler Hamilton of the Toronto Star on the right, Quentin Chiotti from Pollution Probe on the left. My thanks to everybody for your participation tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.